Oil surging and Asian stocks falling as Israel carries out what it calls preemptive strikes on Iran as nuclear tensions boil over. Indian markets also called lower, with the oil majors in focus. New Delhi is a major buyer of Iranian crude. Tehran vowing to retaliate, saying Tel Aviv will pay a heavy price. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying Tehran's nuclear enrichment program is a threat to Israel.
If not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. This is a clear and present danger to Israel's very survival.
And India looks for answers following the devastating Air India crash in Ahmedabad on Thursday. Reports suggest one of the plane's black boxes has been found. Our top story this morning, Israel carrying out what it calls preemptive strikes against Iran. Officials in Israel saying operations are ongoing and it is targeting dozens of sites across Iran, including military and energy infrastructure targets. Iranian officials told Reuters that Israel should expect a harsh response. Officials in Israel saying operations are ongoing and it is targeting sites, dozens of sites across Iran, including military and energy infrastructure. Iranian officials told Reuters that Israel should expect a harsh response, with reports of serious damage and explosions at Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. The move comes amid tensions over US efforts to halt Iranian production of nuclear material and just days before expected US-Iran talks over a framework on a nuclear deal. Israel's Prime Minister saying the operation will last for as long as necessary.
A targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival. This operation will continue for as many days as it takes to remove this threat. We struck at the heart of Iran's nuclear enrichment program. We struck at the heart of Iran's nuclear weaponization program. We targeted Iran's main enrichment facility in Natanz. We targeted Iran's leading nuclear scientists working on the Iranian bomb. We also struck at the heart of Iran's ballistic missile program.
We're also watching oil, which of course is the most evident expression of these supply risks in the Middle East region. Light sweet crude, WTI up by 11%, Brent crude up by 10%. Risk coming off the table with equities dropping across the region. This is the picture in APAC. We're seeing losses of over 1%, particularly for the oil importing countries, the net importers, including Korea and Japan. So the benchmarks in those two respective countries really having coming off the worst, down by more than 1%. That money is flowing into safe havens. This is a classic risk-off trade like gold and government debt, and commodity currencies and the major FX rates are also playing something of a safe harbour and a risk-averse on the other side role. We are seeing the global risk proxies like the Australian dollar on the back foot. However, there is some inflow into the Japanese yen against the US dollar, 143.18. Dollar broadly, the dollar as measured by the DXY, 98.10. CNBC's Eamon Javers joins us now live from DC. Eamon, the administration was keen almost to distance itself from this Israeli action, but the Israelis are now saying that this was coordinated with the United States. Where does this leave the prospects for any kind of diplomatic off-ramp?
I mean, I think diplomacy is on the back foot now at this point. Once you move into this realm of military action, it's very hard to get back to the negotiating table. So we'll see what happens with these U.S.-Iranian talks. We're seeing, I think, a significant split reaction along partisan lines here in Washington tonight. I'll give you two examples. Senator Jack Reed, a Democrat, who's the top Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee, said tonight, Israel's alarming decision to launch airstrikes on Iran is a reckless escalation that risks igniting regional violence. These strikes threaten not only the lives of innocent civilians, but the stability of the entire Middle East and the safety of American citizens and forces. On the flip side, though, you have Republican House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, who says Iran has refused to dismantle its nuclear program, which puts America at risk and poses an existential threat to Israel. Tonight, Israel is taking action to defend itself, and we stand with Israel. The interesting thing here is that the White House itself is not as strongly supportive, certainly, as some Republican members of Congress have been tonight. The White House sending out a statement only from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, not from President Trump himself, and that statement saying simply that the United States had no involvement with that and that Iran should not retaliate against U.S. forces in the region. So the White House eager to keep the U.S. out of this. We'll see what happens when Iran retaliates, which you have to think is inevitable at this point, and whether the United States will come to Israel's aid in defense against any Iranian counterstrikes.
Iran's armed forces spokesman just on this says that Israel carried out these attacks against Iran with U.S. support. Ayman, my final question to you is the planned sixth round of U.S.-Iran nuclear talks that was scheduled for to take place on Sunday in Oman. Is that entirely a non-starter now?
I mean, I think you'd have to assume that it is. We'll wait and see what the official announcements are around that. We know that the president has a meeting with his National Security Council tomorrow morning, Friday, East Coast time here in the U.S., and obviously all sorts of decisions along those lines will be taken then. And clearly, you know, everybody in the U.S. defense and military establishment is watching this overnight. So I think, you know, the other shoes are still to drop, but you'd have to assume that that's very, very difficult to go into a negotiating setting with the backdrop of this military action.
Ayman, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's circle back to Dan Murphy, who's joining us from Dubai. Dan, you and I were talking about this earlier before we came on air, and you look at the scope of the action in the last few hours, and it seems like Israel has annihilated some major leadership figures within the IRGC. So what does that tell you in terms of Iran's capacity to strike back and retaliate?
Well, that's the question at this hour, Sri, and we are getting our first reaction now from Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, who is alive in the aftermath of this attack. The supreme leader has been speaking on state TV. He says Israel will receive a harsh punishment in the aftermath of this attack. The supreme leader also saying that Israel unleashed its wicked and bloody hand in a crime against Iran, and also adds that this attack revealed Israel's vile nature. Khamenei adding here that several commanders and several scientists were martyred in this Israeli attack. So that gives you a sense of exactly how the Iranians are responding at this hour. Of course, Iran's armed forces spokesman also saying Israel and the US will pay a heavy price for this Israeli attack. What we've seen unfold in the last few hours is Israel launching direct airstrikes on Iran in what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is calling a preemptive operation against Tehran's nuclear program. Netanyahu speaking earlier saying Israel struck Iran's main uranium enrichment facility, targeting Iran's top nuclear scientists and hitting the core of its ballistic missile program. He said this operation would continue for as many days as it takes to remove this threat. Now, what's most significant here is that Iran has also confirmed now that Hossein Salami, the commander-in-chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, was killed in this strike. He was reportedly at IRGC headquarters in Tehran when the building was hit. That is a very significant development. The IRGC is one of the core apparatuses of the Iranian state. It controls significant functions of the government, and its reach touches almost every angle of operations inside of Iran. So this marks one of the most serious escalations in the Israeli-Iran tensions that we've seen in years. And what's also most significant here is that the United States says it was not directly involved. It's very interesting to see Israel essentially acting unilaterally here to achieve its goals. And of course, Israel also declaring a national state of emergency now. We heard earlier from Israel's defense minister saying that missile and drone attacks from Iran are now likely. So there is an effort now underway in Israel to prepare its population for what could be a response from Iran. What that response looks like, of course, remains to be seen at this point. But given the messaging that we're now seeing from the Iranians and Iran's supreme leader in the aftermath of the killing of the top commander of the IRGC, it is likely that we will see a response. Of course, a big question mark about what that is going to look like. Sri, also important to point out here that this strike comes just days after we saw the UN nuclear watchdog found Iran in violation of its nuclear obligations. For the first time in 2 decades, actually putting out a document saying that it was in breach. And of course, that just adds fuel to this significant fire in the aftermath of what has been real concerns on the ground in Israel. Israeli officials growing increasingly alarmed over signs that the US and Iran were perhaps nearing a new nuclear agreement, a deal that Israel viewed as dangerous and unacceptable. Israel, of course, making clear that Iran cannot have a nuclear enrichment program. And the fear on the ground inside Israel was that given the negotiations that we've seen unfolding between the US and Iran, that month after month, back and forth, those negotiations continue to unfold without a deal in place. Israel was clearly concerned that perhaps the United States might have come to some kind of an agreement that would have seen an enrichment program being allowed. That is a red line for Israel. They say, of course, that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. Now, of course, the United States is also aligned with that. We've heard from US President Donald Trump, who says he, of course, would also not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But clearly, this was a bridge too far for the Israelis, which is why we've seen this response unfolding today. Of course, the region, as I said, now bracing for what could happen next. What we know is that there were scheduled talks set to take place on Sunday in Oman between the US envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Iranian officials. Whether or not those talks will actually go ahead now, of course, remains to be seen. What this does for the future negotiations of Iran's nuclear program is also unknown at this point. Will this embolden the Iranian position on enrichment and on their nuclear program? Will this essentially stop the United States from trying to achieve that negotiation and actually getting a deal done? We still don't know. And of course, what all of this means for the Gulf states and the wider region is a big question mark at this point too. This certainly puts countries like Saudi Arabia, which does have formal ties with Iran now, and of course the UAE, also in quite a challenging position here, just given the spike that we've seen in regional tensions and the uncertainty that people in this part of the world now face as they wake up this morning to this most recent Israeli strike. Sri?
And the oil markets are the most clearest expression of this, and we are seeing a clear reaction today to these events. And we have a map there for the viewers on the screen, pinpointing the Strait of Hormuz, which you and I know is a vital waterway. It's a choke point for almost a third of the world's oil flows. Is it at risk, Dan?
That's a great question at this point, Sri. Of course, we don't know what type of reaction we're going to see from the Iranian proxies as well, what's left of Hamas and Hezbollah, whether or not we will see some kind of response. And of course, the Houthis are also on watch at this point too. Whether or not we see that, of course, is unknown at this point. What we do know is that oil has skyrocketed off the back of this because there is a supply risk. In previous tit-for-tat conflicts, there hasn't been a supply risk, but this time is different. The Israelis are actively targeting these Iranian nuclear sites and, of course, leaving open the option. You heard there Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying this operation could continue 4 days. It leaves the door open. It leaves the Israelis the option of striking oil facilities as well, which is why we have seen oil prices move higher off the back of this. Certainly off the highs of the session, at one point up double digits, now up just under 10% here. WTI sub 75, Brent now above that 75 USD handle. A real supply risk here because, of course, OPEC, Iran is also part of OPEC here, and we have seen Iranian barrels coming back on this market despite the heavy and significant sanctions that we see from the United States and others on that country. So all eyes are on what happens next with the price of oil and whether or not we will see perhaps additional Israeli action against these Iranian oil facilities too. Whether or not we also see disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz is a clear question at this point as well. Perhaps not in the immediate aftermath of this attack, but indeed in the weeks and months to come. What impact will this have on those Iranian proxies? Will they too be emboldened to perhaps also act unilaterally here? That is unknown at this point. But Sri, the region absolutely on edge here, and we're likely to see this uncertainty also filter through to risk assets when a local trade opens up as well. Losses expected in Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the equity front. And of course, what happens next, as I mentioned, with the price of oil is going to be very closely watched as well.
Interesting, Dan. Thank you very much indeed for that. And we are seeing a sell-off in the Asian markets, but at this point in time, it does seem to be relatively contained. Let's see how this eventuates and transpires. Let's bring in Ellen Wald now, President at Transversal Consulting. Ellen, great to have you on the programme. How much oil is at risk, given what has developed in the last few hours?
Well, this may be, not the popular opinion, but I'm going to go out there and say that not very much oil supply is actually at risk. What we're seeing is a really interesting confluence of events. Yes, these strikes, the Israeli strikes, are absolutely more significant than anything we've seen thus far, but it does not appear that they have targeted any Iranian oil production or oil export facilities. Now, we do know that there are some nuclear facilities that are close by oil facilities, so there may be some concern there, but there's no direct targeting of Iran's oil or oil export facilities, which means that Iran should be able to continue to export oil just as it had, yesterday and days before. And that means that for Iran, there really is no net benefit to trying to impede the passage of oil through the Straits of Hormuz. Because if they try to impede the passage of other oil through there, then they're going to be retaliated against as well. So, it works both ways. Then there's the question of, can Iran actually do that? Can they actually physically block the Straits of Hormuz? And I think that that's really up for debate, especially considering how, yes, the current traffic patterns for ships do run through Iranian waters, but they could be diverted, and other ships do divert into UAE and Omani waters. So while there would be a period of disruption, it's not likely to last all that long. And then the third consideration here really is China. China is the biggest customer of oil in the Middle East.
Yes.
It's not the United States. And China is Iran's most important customer. Chinese-Iranian economic relations are extremely tight. Iran buys a huge amount of things from China, largely because China buys a lot of their oil and they have a lot of Chinese currency to spend. And China does not want the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf to be disrupted in any way.
Yes.
And China does not want the price of oil to rise. And so they're going to bring the full weight of their economic power to bear on Iran, as well as any other partners that they can influence to keep this conflict, which is surely going to continue to grow, from impacting the flow and the safe passage of oil.
Ellen, and you are echoing a point from our prior guest on our prior programme, Anas Sahalji, who said that there is a considerably favourable inventory position and excess in China as far as oil products are concerned that will act as a buffer and a cushion. So, net, do you feel that this reaction that we are seeing with Brent crude in the mid-70s, WTI in the mid-70s, up by 9% is an overreaction and the prices will stabilise? despite the severity of the headlines?
I do think that the prices will stabilize. I do think that given the fact that, given the headlines and given the way that we've seen oil prices react to prior, strikes in the area, that it's not, I don't see this as an overreaction. I do think it will come down. I think that, when trading opens in the U.S. tomorrow, we are going to see prices calm down. Maybe, I don't think we're going to go all the way back down to where it was before this happened, but I don't think that, an 11% jump is really what is really warranted in this, and things are going to calm down because that's generally how it works. The price spikes, and then once people realize, hey, wait, there isn't all that much physical threat to oil supplies, it's going to calm back down. Now, of course, we're now re-entering this cycle that we were in previously where, one party does something, the other one vows retribution, and that retribution could come tomorrow, it could come next week, it could come next month. And so there's definitely going to be a heightened, risk premium that we're going to be seeing, on through this entire issue here. But I don't think we're looking at anything, say, as severe as when, Russia invaded Ukraine. It's just not that significant a threat, I think, to oil supplies. I mean, at that point, like Europe was, there was the potential for Europe to have massive blackouts. That's not what we're looking at here. Remember, the United States is the largest oil producer in the world right now, and its flow of oil is totally unaffected by this. This is not the same oil market as we had in the 90s and in the early 2000s. This is a very different picture. And so while I do see the jump as understandable, I don't think that, say, $100 a barrel oil is really warranted as a call in this situation.
And do you feel, Ellen, and we are, when you look at global inventories, we are flush with crude oil. Do you feel that OPEC Plus's policy of keeping markets well supplied, with the benefit of hindsight and in the light of these actions and the geopolitical risk that is injected, that may be momentary, was a good policy?
I do, and I think that I don't necessarily think that they were looking at this as a possibility, that they were saying, we've got to make sure oil markets are well supplied in the event that, Israel decides to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. But I absolutely think that this is a good move, and I'm sure that OPEC will be more than happy, or various members of OPEC who would be more than happy to increase oil production to, combat this or any disruptions in, say, Iranian oil. I mean, you're going to have the UAE would love to export more oil, and they have ways to do it that, don't depend on the Strait of Hormuz. So I do think that you'll definitely see OPEC and OPEC Plus more than happy to step in should the situation call for it.
Ellen, that said, they don't want prices too high. They don't want demand destruction. They don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg, right? So at what price point does it become problematic from a demand destruction point of view for net importers, for major importers like India?
Yeah, I think in this economic environment, we're looking at, say, $85, $90 a barrel. Does somewhat depend on whether Russian oil keeps, whether Russian oil climbs at the same rate, and whether they're really willing to seriously defy the price cap issue. Because India, for example, buys a lot of Russian oil, and they're going to be exceedingly happy to continue to buy oil at $60 from Russia when everybody else is got to buy it at a much higher rate. So that's certainly something to consider. But once you're getting into, I think, the high 80s, 90s level, that does become a concern in this economic environment.
Alan, let me just present the counterfactual and just ask you, is energy infrastructure in the region at risk, and is Saudi at risk? And we recall the attack on Abqaiq Quraysh back in September 2019, Aramco's facility, believed to be carried out by the Iranian-backed Houthi movement. Yes, we all know that they have been weakened, these proxies have been weakened, but do they pose a threat? And do these Israeli strikes against Iran take the risks to any energy infrastructure in the Middle East region to a new level?
So I do think that it does increase the risk and the threat. The idea that Iran would retaliate against Saudi Arabia in reaction to, or that Iran would have proxies retaliate against Saudi Arabia in reaction to something that Israel and it sees the U.S. as complicit is not. I don't see that as particularly effective for its purposes, unless the purpose is simply to confound oil markets. Simply because Iran and Saudi Arabia have benefited from their renewed ties. Saudi Arabia is pretty silent on this as of now. It will be interesting to see what they're saying, but I'm sure that they are, there's heightened, concern regarding all oil facilities, and that potentially you have, the United States saying, they're reassuring them in some way for the safety of their oil facilities. But the prior attack, I think, was probably a very good wake-up call in that they need to be on higher alert as these events do unfold.
Alan, I know it's still very early days, but would you rule out a move to $100 a barrel oil?
I mean, you never say never. I mean, Ali Naimi used to say, if I knew where the price of oil was going, I'd be in Vegas, and I don't. But it seems to me that that's very unlikely, given the way this is unfolding, the amount of oil on the market now, and who the biggest producers are, and what the incentives are for the largest consumers. And that, yes, China does have great stockpiles, but do they really want to have to tap into them for any kind of extended period of time? They're not going to want to see the flow of oil from the Middle East obstructed, because that's a really huge deal for them, even if they've got a lot of stockpiles. And so I think there will be considerable weight from them if that looks like there's a possibility.
Alan, thank you very much indeed for those insights. Alan Wald there from Transversal Consulting. We'll be keeping track of this breaking story all morning. You can also track it by logging onto our digital arm, CNBC.com, where we have a live vlog inside India. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Let's take a look at oil markets, which are surging after Israel launched a series of strikes targeting Iran's nuclear facilities. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei vowing Tel Aviv will receive, quote, harsh punishment. The IAEA saying it is in contact with Iranian authorities and monitoring radiation levels around the Natanz nuclear facility that was targeted in the attacks. Now, my colleague JP Ong has been tracking the regional response to this story and evidently calls to de-escalate, JP.
Yeah, it's growing for the most part across the Asia-Pacific. Now, we're waiting to hear from Southeast Asian leaders in one, but we already have responses, and pretty firm responses and concerned responses, that is, from New Zealand, Australia, and Japan. We did hear from Prime Minister Christopher Luxon of New Zealand saying they were quite surprised and quite concerned, actually, with regards to the attack, saying that the last thing this region actually needs is more military action and the risk associated with it. The last thing is they need is more instability, actually, in a region that's already been buffeted by certain actions and attacks by Israel, for instance, on their military actions in Gaza, and more instability, actually, in the region that could not just complicate things for energy markets, but also for geopolitical stability as well, given the potential for this to actually spill over into other places of the world. This was also echoed by their neighbors, by their Oceanian neighbors, that is, in Australia. Foreign Minister Penny Wong saying they were quite alarmed by the escalation, also echoing the same sentiment, said that this will risk further destabilizing a region that is already volatile as it is at the moment. Australia is now calling on some of its citizens, actually, who live in the Middle East to monitor government advisors from Canberra on travel to that region. This is something Japan has also advised. They've now advised Japanese citizens who are planning to travel to Iran to refrain from traveling to that area. And their Cabinet Secretary Yoshimasa Hayashi has also issued a statement saying that Japan is prepared to conduct all necessary diplomatic efforts to try and de-escalate the situation out there. But what remains to be seen is what leaders in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the rest of the region can actually do to try and calm tensions down, because it seems that by the minute and by the hour, frictions, that is, between Tel Aviv and that of Tehran continue to escalate. And we have to remember that they both have strong military capabilities and seem to be even more and more ready to actually take things further unless cooler heads prevail. But again, that is a big if at the moment, Sri.
Sunday's Iran nuclear talks in Oman, a big open question as well. Doesn't look good. JP, thank you very much indeed for that. Elaine Yu is in Hong Kong and joins me now and is monitoring the Chinese reaction to the Israel strike on Iran. Elaine.
Chinese embassy in Israel has issued a statement reminding citizens to be prepared and to guard against missiles, rockets, drones, and other attacks. Earlier this morning, China's embassy in Iran has also issued a statement to citizens and companies to enhance safety awareness and to closely monitor the situation. The embassy there said the situation is, quote, complex and severe, and tells citizens to avoid traveling to crowded places and sensitive areas. Now, China buys around 90% of Iran's oil exports, and it does not recognize U.S. sanctions. So any threat to stability of oil prices will be a concern for Chinese investors. And the rise in gas and oil prices reflects this very anxiety in case of any supply chain disruptions from an Iranian retaliation. And we see investors flocking to safe haven assets like gold as well. And in China, the CSI 300 Energy Index had an intraday high of 1.45% today. That's the highest in at least 3 weeks, and has paired some gains now, down up 1.2%. But that is still significant because it is against the CSI 300 trading down now 0.75%. So if oil prices stay elevated, global inflationary pressures could give the U.S.'s trading partners, including China, an edge in tariff negotiations. High inflation will also erode the U.S.'s bargaining power when it comes to tariffs. And we will also see if this might give Beijing an opportunity to play peacemaker in the region, to build on its success in brokering the Iran-Saudi Arabia rapprochement. Back to you, Sri.
That's a great point, Elaine. And just on the prospects of a diplomatic off-ramp, remember that on Sunday, the US-Iran nuclear talks were scheduled to take place. And thank you for that, Elaine. And we are getting some lines from the Omani state news agency. Oman says Israel is responsible for this escalation and its consequences after the attack on Iran. And Oman, which is a mediator in the in the Iran-US nuclear talks, says Israeli attacks threatens to eliminate diplomatic solutions and undermine security and stability of the region. So an open question as to whether those talks are actually going to happen at all on Sunday, but we don't have any detail there from the Omani state news agency at this point in time. Let's continue this conversation and bring in the Indian context now and what it means for oil. Mukesh Sadev is with us now, Senior Vice President and Global Head of Commodity Markets at Rystad Energy. Mukesh, thank you very much indeed for your time. What are the implications for India as a net importer at this stage, and how problematic could these developments be if oil prices rise?
Good to be on the show. Now, indeed, this is a very volatile situation, which it has impact not just for Indian markets, because India is a big buyer of the oil. It has impact for probably China and other big players as well. What I would say is that maybe if you look at the fundamental numbers versus any military speculation, one thing is very clear, that Iran has recovered in its production from the lows of 2s to now 4.1 million barrels per day supply. It had a peak of about 4.5 in 2017, 2018. So there are big downside risks because it has recovered a lot. The second point I would say is that the biggest buyer of Iranian oils, as one of your reporters, Elaine, was mentioning, is China. So I guess that this is a big part of the US-Iran negotiation, is a big part of US-China negotiations as well. And we have already seen that the oil prices touched the high of 78, and now they are a little bit in a retreat mode. So I would say that the oil prices, if they really go to much higher levels, then it's a big worrisome for India for sure. But for now, we have to watch what comes next.
Mukesh, what's the red line for India? At what point do oil prices become deeply problematic from an inflationary point of view? And of course, we have to talk about prices maybe close to $90 a barrel and staying there on a sustained basis for it to be really reflected in inflation, which now seems to be quite favourable and well anchored.
Now, you make a good point that, when the oil prices go outside this range of 65 and 70s towards the 80s and 90s, this is certainly very inflationary, especially when we are going to see peak demand season in the Northern Hemisphere as well. And demand for, crude and products is going to rise. That will make even harder for India to probably source the barrel. So I think you are very spot on in saying that the oil prices, but I would add a view that we should not get carried away so fast on this situation to talk about the 80s or the 90s. This, in our view, in our data-driven view, is very much a negotiation play at the point of time. And yes, this is probably part of the negotiation. U.S. is certainly not involved. U.S. has very clear given indications that 60 days we need to have a deal, and those 60 days were probably just around a day or two away. So let's wait to call the 80s or the 90s. I think the key point is that the world OPEC Plus has enough spare capacity to deal with. We have multiple gas side projects also going to come online. So we have spare capacity. We have mechanism in the oil market with the OPEC and the Saudis to contain and let the oil price spike. And let's not forget, this is the summer of 2025. Yes. When U.S. is also going to watch the pump prices, and 80s and 90s won't look good for the U.S. either.
It's interesting that Prime Minister Modi was in Saudi Arabia about 2 months ago and, of course, was negotiating favourable terms and conditions for the continued importation of Saudi crude. However, Mukesh, it's interesting as well that whenever I've spoken to Hardeep Singh Puri, the energy minister, he has said that India is operating within international norms and conditions and will continue to buy Russian oil, Venezuelan oil. At what point does that become problematic for the US-India relationship, especially at a time when we are looking at a bilateral trade agreement perhaps being finalized in October?
Again, I would say that you have hit a very important chord on this US-India relationship and the Russian equation. I think there is one more very important factor that is emerging on the scene, is that in the past, India was buying the Russian oil, refining the Russian oil, and a lot of the Indian products, diesel, was making into Europe. Now there is something on the table which will even ban buying of the products made from the Russian oil. In the past, probably the world was not distinguishing whether the diesel is made from another oil or from a Russian oil. So I get the check on the product exports from India. That would be a bigger deal, and that would prevent India from buying the Russian oil. And that's why India has to really look for alternative sources. So not just bilateral trade negotiations, but I think it is the products market which is becoming extremely critical to answer the crude market questions.
Mukesh, is this price spike and a sobering reminder of the supply risks and the geopolitics, is that going to refocus the minds within India, within policy circles, to accelerate the transition, to accelerate the development of renewable energy?
I think that's indeed a very sobering reminder, for sure. I remember, we lived in the era of higher forever when the oil prices were in the hundreds, and then we landed into the era of lower for longer. I think those days are gone. The geopolitics now is certainly very active, even if the supply-demand fundamentals are there. I call it, we have global spares, but we will have local scares. So I think that's the scare, local scare, which India needs to certainly factor in and transition towards the alternate options on the renewables is certainly, I think, a goal which should not be, in my view, should be kept alive. But India has to navigate through these turbulent times by sourcing the barrels at the most optimal price, because India is a big buyer of the crude. So I guess that is not as easy, but yes, whether the oil prices are 60s or 70s, it's a drain on the Indian forex reserves. Yes. So any methods, any approaches which can reduce that dependence, I guess, is a long-term strategic goal, which certainly should be kept alive with the full force. That would be my view.
And I suppose the open secret is that, Mukesh, India is still going to be joined to the hip to fossil fuels, even coal, to meet its demand profile. So where does this leave the renewable energy capacity target of 500 gigawatts by 2030? Is that, coal still has a part to play in that, ironically, because renewables can't provide, at this point, can't provide the base load, although there are some step changes in terms of innovation, and that's good news. But do you think that this is ambitious or achievable?
I think an excellent point you make around about the coal, right? Sometimes I would say a fast transition can become a failed transition as well. And then you go back to the coal, and all the progress achieved towards the net zero and other carbon things can get eroded. We have also seen that going too fast on the energy transition is also challenging. I was in Madrid when the grid failed, so I have seen firsthand what happens there. So I would say that whether it is achievable or ambitious, the bottom line is there is a capital crunch and there is competition for capital. If the oil side of the equation and drains a lot of the capital, it will certainly have an impact on how fast we go on the energy transition. So I think it's a competition for capital. I would say the ambition is certainly should be there. I think technology and innovation is probably going to be a big part of India's transition like what China has done, rather than just depending upon achieving those targets.
Mukesh, how does LNG fit in, and how would you characterise the supply risks from, let's say, Qatar and major producers in the Gulf to markets like India, and just it is perceived as a less polluting fossil fuel and the transition fuel, some might say the destination fuel, but how does that fit into the equation in India?
I think you make another excellent point that gas certainly is a transition fuel for sure for a lot of other countries, including India. I would say at this point of time, the gas markets are tight. European markets are probably the price kind of driving mechanism in the gas markets. There are some projects coming in the US. There are projects coming in LNG Canada, as well as some projects expansion in Qatar. So I guess there could be some extra, molecules, gas molecules becoming available. But equally, I would say that there is going to stay a very strong competition for those gas molecules. So I guess yes, it's not as bad a situation. Crude certainly is a very tight situation for the Indian markets, and gas would provide some opportunities. But also, again, gas and oil are linked together, so it won't be easy for India to have gas at very economic prices if the oil is not at the right levels.
Mukesh, there's so much to unpack given the energy dynamics as they pertain to India. And let's bring in, as we close out this conversation, a possible trade agreement between the United States and India. We've been hearing a lot about how energy and a commitment to buy US LNG is going to be a central part of this deal. How do you think ultimately that's going to shake out?
Well, I think India, if I understand, again, you make a good point that India has maintained that we will trade with everyone where India's national interests are protected and we can source the molecules. India has certainly bought, I would say, a higher amount of WTI barrels for sure. So that's a clear indication that if India can do on the crude side, India should be looking to do on the gas side as well. So indeed, I would say energy and technology for the transition is certainly going to be a big part of those bilateral deals. And I'm especially concerned about the European, now the ban on purchase of the products made from the Russian oil. That will drive India probably closer to having a deal with the US for sure. So I think that's something very closely to be watched.
Mukesh, we'll leave that conversation there. Thank you very much indeed for your insights on a plethora of issues pertaining to energy in India. Mukesh Shahdev there from Rystad Energy. Right, let's bring you up to speed with some comments from Iran's foreign ministry directed at the international community. Iran's foreign ministry says the Israeli attack exposes global security to an unprecedented threat. Iran's foreign ministry calls upon the international community to condemn Israel's attack. And there's one more line I wanted to bring to you from Iran's foreign ministry, saying that the US, as Israel's main supporter, will be responsible for the consequences of Israel's adventurism. And of course, we've been witnessing some big swings in the price of oil. At one point during the session, in the aftermath of the news of Israel's strikes against Iran, we did see the price of oil up by as much as close to 14%. It has since stabilised, if you can characterise it that way, but still up by well over 9%. So some extreme volatility in the price of oil. Clearly, the oil markets are factoring in disruption to energy infrastructure, whether it's in Iran or Iranian exports or within the broader region. India markets also just coming online, and we are seeing a very negative effect immediately for the Nifty 50, down by 1%, so slipping below 25k, 24,615. So remember that India is a net importer of crude oil, so price swings like the ones that we are seeing here, there's a lot at stake for India. Dollar rupee exchange rate 86.14. So we are seeing associated weakness in the Indian currency to the tune of about 0.7%. We'll bring you more market action after the break. The latest on the Air India Boeing 787 Dreamliner crash that happened yesterday afternoon. The flight from Ahmedabad to London Gatwick fell moments after takeoff, crashing into a residential area. The plane was carrying 242 people, and Air India has confirmed there was a sole survivor who is currently being treated in hospital. It is the first Boeing 787 Dreamliner crash, and we are hearing reports that one of the black boxes has been found. CNBC TV 18's Madiha Mujawar is on the ground in Ahmedabad with the latest. Madiha.
Well, we are currently very close to the crash site. We are just meters away from where the 787 Dreamliner crashed. And behind me, if you could see the buildings behind me, there are 4 buildings, and the last building is where the plane crashed. Currently, we are not allowed to enter the crash site, go very close to the crash site. The area is now completely barricaded because investigating teams are currently on site. They are investigating, they are collecting evidence. The Indian Prime Minister was here minutes ago. He was taking stock of the situation. He was speaking to officials, investigating teams. He also headed to the hospital to meet the injured and to meet the victims and the families of the victims. Remember that the 787 which was having flight AI 171 from Ahmedabad to London had crashed minutes after or seconds after the takeoff. The pilot had announced Mayday only once, and thereafter there was no communication from the pilot's side. And what we heard later and what was seen later was the plane crashing onto this building, and there was smoke emanating from the site. There were 242 passengers on board, including 2 pilots and 10 cabin crew, of which 241 have been declared dead, and only 1 passenger has miraculously survived, and he's believed to have jumped from the emergency gate because his seat was next to the emergency door. So he's believed to have jumped from the emergency gate, and that's how he miraculously survived. The plane, because it was planning a long journey, had 125,000 liters of fuel that it had stored, and that is the reason for the explosion, and that is also the reason why several bodies were seen charred. I mean, there were graphic visuals that we saw where there were no survivors at all apart from the one survivor. This is a major tragedy in India. It is also a major tragedy in the world. We haven't seen such a crash in many years. We have been seeing air tragedies. In 2023 we saw Yeti Airlines crash in Nepal. In 2024 we saw Jeju Air crash and Azerbaijan Airlines crash. In 2025 Air India is the major air tragedy that we are seeing. There are more casualties other than the passengers in the plane. Because the plane crashed onto this medical college hostel, there are more casualties that we don't know of yet. The official number is yet to be out. The investigating teams are on site, and we will keep updating as we get more information.
Mediha, thank you very much indeed for that update. In the meantime, following the Israeli strike on Iran, Delhi Airport says some flight schedules have been impacted due to the evolving airspace conditions over Iran, Iraq and the neighbouring region. Let me just bring you some further updates on this developing story in the Middle East. And we are getting some comments from the White House and US officials who say we still intend to have talks between the US and Iranian envoys, assuming that they will still take place on Sunday in Oman. That's all the time that we have today on Inside India. Do keep watching CNBC. We'll continue to track this developing story of Israel's strikes against Iran with Dan Murphy on Access Middle East.